Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I want to welcome you all to the residency again. I know you've had some welcomes, but I wish I could see your faces. I wish we were all together in that one big room. The summer residency has always been my favorite, and I'm missing you guys. So I hope we'll have a lot of great conversations this week. And I also want to say a special welcome to the new students. This is not obviously how we normally do it. So in a way, we're all new at this. But I think it must be a little bit harder when you don't have, ready-made friends, to kind of go through it with. But so I just want to say, obviously, there are no stupid questions. Ask away. Reach out if you need help, if you're struggling, anything at all. Please let us know. Um, and I also want to say a special word for the graduating students. I hope you'll come back and we'll see you again. I already miss you, and I know this isn't the way that you probably planned your graduation residency, um, but your presence means a lot to us, and we're wishing you well through all of this. I'm going to talk today about problems. You have problems, I have problems. If you're a fiction writer, problems are a good thing. Problems are the lifeblood of stories. But as we've all become painfully aware over the past several months, some problems are so big and pervasive, so daunting, that it's hard to know how to do justice to them on paper, and sometimes hard to believe that writing is even an appropriate response at all. It's easy to think maybe I should just step away from my computer and go do some good in the real world. Poetry, as they say, can save lives, and at least some kinds of nonfiction can be used for advocacy. But fiction, in these circumstances, fiction can seem, kind of like an escape into fantasy. Obviously, that's an oversimplified way of stating things. And in any case, escape can save lives too, especially in really hard times. But I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that if you've been having these doubts, these thoughts, you are not alone. The question of whether to write at all or whether writing can help anybody or change anything is a legitimate concern that plagues me, at least, all the time. In fact, I think part of the reason why so many of my craft talks sort of focus on the physics of storytelling is because that helps me see narrative as a kind of natural force, an instinct, a human instinct that would exist whether we wanted it to or not. Stories are the way that we explain the world to ourselves and to others. The fact that the world seems to be in the midst of kind of cataclysmic change right now may mean that it's more important than ever, in fact, for us to figure out ways to tell stories that will illuminate this process and record it in case anybody survives. Oh, God, that was dark. Still, problems like climate change, systemic racism, the pandemic claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, these problems can seem too big, too daunting to capture adequately on the page, especially if you're new to writing or if you are working in the short story form, because there's just so little space to do justice to such a big problem. So I want to talk today about some different strategies for tackling problems on the page and for understanding the ways that other writers have tackled such problems on the page. Many stories, and especially the stories that reward analysis and reflection, exist on at least two levels. Most narratives have a surface level on which we watch characters grapple with a sequence of problems, and we call that sequence of problems a plot. Fair enough. Complex, enduring stories tend to also have something more, something that runs beneath the surface of the story, beneath that plot. Your high school English teacher might have called that theme, and that's fine. The theme of the story is grief, we might say, or systemic injustice. Okay. I kind of shy away from the term theme because to me it seems to reduce a story's complicated subterranean realm to like a one word concept, as if it were just that simple. And we all know that things like grief, things that are really worthy of theme are never that simple. And they are certainly not static. So let's acknowledge that. One way that I think we can acknowledge it is to sort of name this realm and talk about it more. So I'm going to use the term understory. To me, understory suggests that there is a whole world of dynamic possibilities shifting underneath the surface of the story, and that these possibilities have the potential, not that they necessarily will, but they have the potential to rupture the story, to break through its surface, and to change what is possible, what can happen on the surface. Here's an example. Let's say we start a story with a woman driving along and her car breaks down. That's the first problem. The second problem is it's raining outside and dark. She looks at her phone and it's got no reception. Third problem. She gets out of the car and we see that the road is utterly deserted. That's the fourth problem. But wait, why is that fourth one a problem? What is inherently bad about a woman being alone at night on a dark, deserted road? Sure, the deserted road means that it'll probably take her longer to find someone to help her with her broken car. But I really don't think that that's the problem that you are most worried about. The problem you're most worried about, I haven't told you. The problem you're most worried about is that a woman alone on a deserted road is vulnerable. Centuries of stories, true, false, and otherwise, have taught us to make that assumption. And that assumption is part of the understory on which this plot line is built. In fact, it is such a common part of our understory that it makes that plot line start to feel like a potential cliche, right? If the author just plays right into that and a scary man comes along, we're starting to feel like we're in a bad Hollywood movie, right? We've seen that thing too often. The author doesn't have to even tell us that there's a rapist on the loose in this woman's community. All the stories we've ever been told condition us to imagine that rapist for ourselves. Readers bring to your story every story they've ever read, heard, or seen depicted on screen or in pictures, in ads, in the newspaper, everywhere. That is the foundation on which you build your story. And so I think it's worth considering the interplay between what you're trying to say and what the culture around you has already said to us. And this is where the understory becomes a really interesting thing to think about, because it affords you the possibility not just to talk about and to want to express personal emotional problems like grief, but broader social problems that are in the ether of all of our storytelling and that shape the way that we interpret stories and interpret the world around us. So this is a way of opening up your awareness of the ways that your stories engage not just with the personal problems of your characters, but with the chronic conditions in which your characters live. It may not fit for every story in the world, but I think that it can be useful to think of this as a sort of schema where we can break stories into two levels. The surface story, where characters grapple externally with acute problems, and the understory, where characters grapple internally or subconsciously with chronic underlying conditions. So I should take a time out and say that I might be stealing this terminology. I mean, it's obviously from medicine, acute versus chronic. I associate it with a craft talk or something that I think Pete Fromm said at some point several years ago here at Pacific. I think he said it in a sort of offhanded comment, which I don't know if that means that this is just part of the vocabulary that every writer of fiction talks about, or if it was something that Pete was making up on the fly, or if maybe I dreamed it and Pete never said it. I have sent Pete an email to ask him whether he is the source of this language or if someone else is, and he has yet to answer me. But as soon as he does, I will let you know. But it's not new terminology in the world, acute versus chronic. I just think that it's a useful analogy for fiction writers. So that's my time out. In medicine, acute problems are finite, observable, often resolvable things like a broken bone or a clogged artery. They're exciting to observe, very dramatic, they're hard to ignore. They are problems that have come to a head and they demand action. So they bring a sense of urgency, intensity, and focus to a story. They also offer the possibility of resolution, which is useful in storytelling because this fits the shape of storytelling. We have the emergence, then the intensification, and the ultimate resolution of a problem, which is pretty much the archetypal shape that stories take, or so we're told. Because of all this, acute problems tend to be the primary engines of suspense and tension in a story. And they are generally revealed explicitly on the surface of the story. Usually, even the most basic reader can explain to you what the acute problems were, what the basic plot line of the story was. The understory, on the other hand, is where characters grapple not with acute, observable, resolvable problems, but with chronic underlying conditions. In medicine, the acute problem of a broken bone might reveal that the patient has been suffering for years from osteoporosis. The acute problem of a heart attack might reveal that a person has been living with heart disease for, half their lives. The patient might not even realize they have that chronic underlying condition. Chronic conditions are the water we swim in. We don't always notice it. They come on so gradually and are so pervasive that we often can't even recognize that they are the thing troubling us. This makes chronic problems seem undramatic and unurgent. It doesn't mean that they're not important. But on their own, chronic conditions are hard to dramatize in scene because they are either so interior or so complicated or so long-lasting and messy that they need to be explained at length or lived through many years, through many characters, in order to be understood. But that's okay because careful readers, literary readers, want to do that work. We want to lean in and watch the surface of the story very closely to try to figure out what's going on under the surface. It's one of the joys that we get for the work that we put into a story. And so don't feel that you're losing something by leaving some things buried. That is part of what the reader wants. The reader wants to watch closely and figure it out for themselves. And this is good because chronic conditions tend to be the stuff that give real resonance and social relevance to stories. So I'm going to talk more about this in a minute, but first I want to share with you a short story by John Cheever that I think illustrates this dichotomy or this interplay between two things pretty well. So as you listen to this story, I want you to think about what aspects of the story you think constitute acute problems on the surface of the story, on the plot line, and what aspects of the story you think constitute the chronic underlying conditions or the understory. Reunion by John Cheever. It was published in 1962 in The New Yorker. The last time I saw my father was in Grand Central Station. I was going from my grandmother's in the Adirondacks to a cottage on the Cape that my mother had rented, and I wrote my father that I would be in New York between trains for an hour and a half, and asked if we could have lunch together. His secretary wrote to say that he would meet me at the information booth at noon, and at 12 o'clock sharp I saw him coming through the crowd. He was a stranger to me. My mother divorced him 3 years ago, and I hadn't been with him since. But as soon as I saw him, I felt that he was my father, my flesh and blood, my future, and my doom. I knew that when I was grown I would be something like him. I would have to plan my campaigns within his limitations. He was a big, good-looking man, and I was terribly happy to see him again. He struck me on the back and shook my hand. "Hi, Charlie," he said. "Hi, boy. I'd like to take you up to my club, but it's in the 60s, and if you have to catch an early train, I guess we'd better get something to eat around here." He put his arm around me, and I smelled my father the way my mother sniffs a rose. It was a rich compound of whiskey, aftershave lotion, shoe polish, woolens, and the rankness of a mature male. I hoped that someone would see us together. I wished that we could be photographed. I wanted some record of our having been together. We went out of the station and up a side street to a restaurant. It was still early and the place was empty. The bartender was quarreling with a delivery boy, and there was one very old waiter in a red coat down by the kitchen door. We sat down, and my father hailed the waiter in a loud voice. "Kellner," he shouted. "Garçon, cameriere, you." His boisterousness in the empty restaurant seemed out of place. "Could we have a little service here?" he shouted. "Chop, chop." Then he clapped his hands. This caught the waiter's attention, and he shuffled over to our table. "Were you clapping your hands at me?" he asked. Calm down, sommelier," my father said. "If it isn't too much to ask of you, if it wouldn't be too much above and beyond the call of duty, we would like a couple of Beefeater Gibsons." "I don't like to be clapped at," the waiter said. "I should have brought my whistle," my father said. "I have a whistle that is audible only to the ears of old waiters. Now take out your little pad and your little pencil and see if you can get this straight. 2 Beefeater Gibsons. Repeat after me. 2 Beefeater Gibsons." "I think you'd better go somewhere else," the waiter said quietly. That, said my father, is one of the most brilliant suggestions I have ever heard. Come on, Charlie, let's get the hell out of here. I followed my father out of that restaurant into another. He was not so boisterous this time. Our drinks came, and he cross-questioned me about the baseball season. He then struck the edge of his empty glass with his knife and began shouting again. Garçon, Kellner, Cameriere, you! Could we trouble you to bring us 2 more of the same? How old is the boy? The waiter asked. That, my father said, is none of your goddamn business. I'm sorry, sir, the waiter said, but I won't serve the boy another drink. Well, I have some news for you, my father said. I have some very interesting news for you. This doesn't happen to be the only restaurant in New York. They've opened another on the corner. Come on, Charlie. He paid the bill, and I followed him out of that restaurant into another. Here the waiters wore pink jackets like hunting coats, and there was a lot of horse tack on the walls. We sat down, and my father began to shout again. Master of the hounds, tally-ho, and all that sort of thing. We'd like a little something in the way of a stirrup cup, namely 2 bibs and geefeaters. And geefeaters? The waiter asked, smiling. You know damned well what I want, my father said angrily. I want 2 beefeater Gibsons, and make it snappy. Things have changed in jolly old England, so my friend the Duke tells me. Let's see what England can produce in the way of a cocktail. This isn't England, the waiter said. Don't argue with me, my father said. Just do as you're told. I just thought you might like to know where you are, the waiter said. If there is one thing I cannot tolerate, my father said, it is an impudent domestic. Come on, Charlie. The 4th place we went to was Italian. Buongiorno, my father said. Per favore, possiamo avere 2 cocktail americani. Forti forti, molto gin, poco vermouth. I don't understand Italian, the waiter said. Oh, come off it, my father said. You understand Italian, and you know damned well you do. Vogliamo 2 cocktail americani, subito. The waiter left us and spoke with the captain, who came over to our table and said, I'm sorry, sir, but this table is reserved. All right, my father said. Get us another table. All the tables are reserved, the captain said. I get it, my father said. You don't desire our patronage, is that it? Well, the hell with you. Vada el inferno. Let's go, Charlie. I have to get my train, I said. I'm sorry, Sonny, my father said. I'm terribly sorry. He put his arm around me and pressed me against him. I'll walk you back to the station, if there had only been time to go up to my club. That's all right, Daddy, I said. I'll get you a paper, he said. I'll get you a paper to read on the train. Then he went up to a newsstand and said, Kind sir, will you be good enough to favor me with one of your goddamned no-good 10-cent afternoon papers? The clerk turned away from him and stared at a magazine cover. Is it asking too much, kind sir, my father said. Is it asking too much for you to sell me one of your disgusting specimens of yellow journalism? I have to go, Daddy, I said. It's late. Now just wait a second, Sonny, he said. Just wait a second. I want to get a rise out of this chap. Goodbye, Daddy, I said, and I went down the stairs and got my train, and that was the last time I saw my father. So there's a lot that I could say about this story. I really like it. But I think you can see it's one of those rare stories. There are not many of these where we can actually chart out that rare bird, the Freytag triangle of plot, where we literally just follow a character in scene. It starts off with Charlie wanting to see his father, making a plan to see his father, going to meet him. They go into one bar, get rebuffed. Go into the next bar, get rebuffed. Go into the next bar, get rebuffed. The 4th bar, and that's the crisis when Charlie finally says he has to go. It almost has a kind of fairy tale structure, right? Where we get, the 3 or maybe 4 iterations of attempts to get something done. So this is a classic character trying to grapple with acute problems on the surface of a story. That's a plot line. The father wants a drink, the father can't get a drink. The father wants a drink, can't get a drink. He keeps trying, and his own obnoxiousness, his own, classist self, superiority and drunkenness, thwart him at every turn. And so finally, we see that Charlie's his desire to see his father and connect with his father finally, reaches the breaking point, and he says, "Okay, that's it. Time's up. I have to go." Um, and even then, the father can't just let it go. The father has to pick yet one more fight. And so this is just a really simple, really clean, lean plot line. And of course, we also can tell that it's not that hard to tell that there's this thing going on underneath of the story, which is Charlie's growing awareness of just how alcoholic his father is and how obnoxious his father is, and what life with his father would really be like. There's a number of lines like, just do as you're told, that you can feel were probably things that he would have been saying had he been living in the house with Charlie. And even though so much of the story is built on this very superficial plot line, we can tell that in the beginning of it, in that crucial opening paragraph, Cheever has already ceded all of this attention to the understory. The last time I saw my father announces that, something's going to go wrong. He was a stranger to me, but as soon as I saw him, I felt that he was my father, my flesh and blood, my future and my doom. We get a sense of the father's whiskey smell, like at noon, so we know that the alcoholism is already seated here as a potential problem. We get the son's yearning, right? I hoped that someone would see us together. I wished that we could be photographed, and so on. So we have a sense of the son's yearning and a sense of what problems are going to get in the way of that. But to go back to what I was talking about earlier, it's not just the emotional resonance of this set of interior problems that we're watching in the understory. We're also getting a lot of subtle information about other sociological stuff that extends beyond the frame of the story, and sort of comments on what's going on in our world around us, at least in the years when this story was published, and obviously to some extent today. There's a lot of stuff going on with class in this story. There's a lot of stuff going on with, a sense of white male entitlement, and how, that doesn't play very well anymore, right? Each of the waiters is pushing back, even at these kind of, fairly nice restaurants and bars. They're not having it from this man. He is either so drunk that he is buffoonish to them, which is probably a lot of it, but at the same time they're standing up to this person and they're saying, we're not having it, go somewhere else. So there's a limit to his power. That's what we're watching happening. We're seeing this sort of like well-off, privileged, entitled white man get taken down a notch. And that's part of where the comedy comes in, and also sort of some of where the pathos comes in, right? He comes across as pathetic. Now, he couldn't come across as pathetic to us if we didn't already have a preconceived sense of what a well-off white man in Manhattan is supposed to behave like and is supposed to have achieved, or what level of status or respect he's supposed to be afforded, right? So all of that is stuff that we're bringing into this story. And Cheever is using what we've brought to the story in order to not have to say it. He doesn't have to say it himself. He doesn't have to tell us, this man is a lawyer and is quite accomplished. No, he has a secretary who handles even his correspondence with his son. And that reveals a lot to us, right? So all of our understandings of customs, norms, social positioning, status, class, all of that stuff is stuff that we bring into the story, and we read the story in those terms, against those kind of measures. So just to kind of codify it for you in words, I would say that the understory can reveal or involve unutterable, taboo, or repressed emotional content. I think we all understand that. And this is related to subtext. That's the stuff that characters, in scene might think or feel but not say, or not be able to say in the moment. So the son never says, "Geez, Dad, you're an alcoholic. I had really been looking forward to this, but you kind of ruined it. I never want to see you again." The son doesn't say any of that. He says, "Daddy." And so that use of the word daddy, it indicates not just what the son is rejecting, but also what he still kind of wants. And that it reminds us that the son is still a boy. In other words, subtext and understory are places where a lot of complexity can happen. When we don't have to say something explicitly, we can say many things at once. They just exist side by side. Another thing that understory reveals is socio-political context, as I was talking about, as well as entrenched assumptions and patterns of expectation, not just about the world of the story, but also about storytelling itself, about who gets to tell the story and how, with what kind of language, and to whom, who the audience is going to be, and what are they exactly expected to understand, right? One of the ways that the understory functions is to create a sense of who's included in the telling, who this story is directed to. To give you a sense of this, I want to read you just a very short excerpt from the beginning of the story Lockwood, which is from Brian Washington's recent collection of stories called Lot, and I think you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. Roberto was brown, and his people lived next door, so of course I went over on weekends. They were full Mexican. That made us superior. My father found every opportunity to say it, but not to their faces. So Ma took it upon herself to visit most evenings. She still didn't have many friends on the block. We were too dark for the Blancos, too Latin for the blacks. But Roberto's mother dug the company. She invited us in. Her husband worked construction, pouring cement into Grand Parkway, and they didn't have any papers, so you know how that goes. No one was hiring. She wasn't about to take chances. What she did with her days was look after Roberto. They lived in this shotgun with swollen pipes. It was the house you shook your head at when you drove up the road. Ma brought over yucca and beans from the restaurant, but then my father saw and asked her who the fuck had paid for it. Javi, Jan, and I watched our parents circle the kitchen until our father grabbed a bowl of rice and threw it on the tile. He said this was what it felt like to watch her money walk. Maybe now Ma'd think before she'd shit on her familia. And of course it didn't stop her. If anything, she went more often, but Ma started leaving the meals at home. Instead, she brought me and some coffee and tinned crackers. So there is all kinds of exciting stuff happening in this excerpt. First of all, we get this really interesting voice that immediately talks to us like a close friend, an insider. You know how that goes. Rather than privileging conventional mainstream white discourse patterns, Brian Washington delivers the voice of his character without overt explanation, without saying, "Good afternoon, mainstream American readers who may not know the city of Houston very well. Let me take a moment to orient you." No, he just plunges readers in. This is not the only way to go. It is one way to go. There are many ways to do all of this. I just want to show you a few of the ways and talk about how they function. So even though Washington doesn't explicitly orient us, he certainly does give us plenty of careful writing and clues so that we can orient ourselves really pretty quickly and understand what's happening. But the choice not to explicitly orient the reader is one aspect of the understory that has both aesthetic and political implications, of course. If choices of this sort interest you, I would encourage you to check out a really interesting craft talk that Rebecca Mackay gave on the implied listener or reader of the story. She calls it the ear of the story, and it's on the Tin House podcast called Between the Covers. That's Rebecca Mackay on the Tin House podcast, Between the Covers. Maybe I shouldn't be plugging them, but anyway, it's very interesting. It's another Portland, organization, so you should be aware of it. They have a lot of cool stuff on that podcast. Anyway, back to the Brian Washington story. The third paragraph here, we get this beautiful scene where we get to see the parents fighting. Now, anytime you can watch people fight, you get to learn all kinds of really cool things about them that they would never tell you explicitly. To some extent, this particular fight feels a little bit like many fights. It's a surrogate fight, potentially. It's not exactly about whether or not the mother should be allowed to go over to the neighbor's house. It seems like, in the subtext, it seems like there's maybe something else going on where the father feels like he's not happy with how she spends their money, or he feels that she doesn't fully appreciate the hard work that he does at the restaurant. Maybe something like that is going on in the subtext. But what we also learn, which is part of the understory, what we also learn in the fight is we learn things about their limits and about their patterns of treating one another in this family. When we see those kids watching their parents circle the kitchen as they start to fight, I mean, A, that's a really fun image, but B, if these parents fought in really horrific ways, the kids might probably run and hide or maybe try and stop them, but the kids don't. They're sort of like, ooh, a fight. So that already kind of sets the tone for us to understand that these kids feel safe enough. And then the father's big gesture, in this fight that is worth narrating, right? All families fight all the time. Not all the fights make it into a story. So the fight that made it into this story is, the father's big gesture is he throws a bowl of rice onto the floor. So, on the scale of big gestures, that is somewhere in the middle. Like in some families, that's not a very scary gesture. In other families, that would be a pretty scary gesture or a pretty, extreme gesture. So this is just an example of how one simple acute action, acute problem in scene physically shows us a whole bunch of stuff about the understory of this family and helps us understand volumes about how they interact with one another, what their power dynamics are, and what their customs are, right? So even though the father erupts, the mother still goes back to the neighbor's house, right? So there's this tension between the two of them. She stands up for what she wants, but she does change her behavior. She stops bringing the meals over there, but she still goes over and she brings some other things, including her son, right? So she's pushing back, and that's really fun to see. And it shows me a lot about how this family functions overall. Okay, so how does this apply to your writing? I want to take a few minutes to kind of recap what I've said and give you a bit of advice on how you can use these concepts to create stories or to improve stories. So just to recap, acute problems tend to be finite, physically observable problems that get portrayed explicitly on the surface of the story so that we can watch them unfold in scene. Acute problems also give urgency and drama to a story. Many plots are structured as a chain reaction of acute problems. This means that acute problems also give shape or structure to a story. The story usually starts at around the time when the character is confronted with the first acute problem, and then it ends around the time when the last acute problem is solved. Acute problems build tension and suspense around the question of whether and how the characters will overcome these problems. When characters succeed or fail at solving the problems, the surface story can achieve resolution and come to an end, even if the chronic underlying conditions remain unresolved. While acute problems tend to get resolved, one way or another, by story's end, chronic conditions are notoriously difficult to resolve, and stories often end with them unresolved. Sometimes it's enough of a change for a character to just discover that they are living with a chronic condition. We call this an epiphany. Usually, in the first parts of the story, the chronic condition is hidden. We don't usually express it up front explicitly. Sometimes the characters and the readers don't fully realize what the chronic underlying conditions are until very late in the story. We read about the acute problems in order to discover what the chronic underlying conditions are, and we look for patterns in the surface problems to reveal that subsurface or the understory. At the start of the story, the narrator might not have really known or fully understood that his dad was an alcoholic, or that his own fate would be tied to his dad's limitations. But by the story's end, readers understand, without having to be told outright, that these are the underlying conditions each character is actually grappling with. So, how can this help you write a story? You can work in either direction. You can start with an acute problem and build a sequence of events or problems that may eventually reveal a chronic underlying condition, or you can start with a chronic underlying condition that interests you or is troubling you, and invent a sequence of acute problems that illuminate it or that kind of trouble it or complicate it. Most writers, I think, subconsciously do some combination of the two. Either way, keep an open mind as you proceed. Your job is to explore and to try to discover new insights about the human condition, rather than just prove what you already thought you knew before starting the story. You have to let the story teach you and surprise you along the way. Okay, so let's say you start from an acute problem. You have some little nagging incident that has lodged itself in your imagination and you're not sure why or where it's going to go to become a story. Let's say you've got this line, my roommate puked in my purse last night. That's an acute problem. It's a serious drag. On its own, it doesn't make a story. It's a bit of an anecdote, maybe. But the thing that will make it a story is, first of all, if you think about, what led up to that, what is the sequence of events? Is that the crisis, the climax, the straw that broke the camel's back that made you decide you got to move out of your apartment and get a different roommate? Or was it the first time that you realized, oh, there's a bigger problem going on here? Was it the first time that some chronic underlying condition burst through the surface and came to a head in this physical, acute problem? So, you know, just as Chris Abani was talking about in his craft talk from January, the way to get at the chronic underlying conditions is to keep asking the question why. So if you have this incident, my roommate puked in my purse last night, and you say why, maybe it's simply my roommate is a raging alcoholic and it's come to a head and I'm going to have to talk to them about it. And this gives me all kinds of stress and they've been living with it and I've been ignoring it and enabling it and all this sort of stuff. Like that's the chronic underlying condition that is going to be running under the surface of whatever's happening before and after the incident of the puking in the purse. Of course, it's worth also remembering that you don't always want to go for the most obvious reason when you ask the question why. So maybe it's not that your roommate is a raging alcoholic. Maybe they are on chemo. Maybe they, are undergoing some other medical issue, or maybe they have anxiety to such a degree. There's a lot of things that could cause somebody to do that. And you want to kind of give your characters the full kind of dignity of their experience, that you are willing to look deeper than just the first answer to the question why. At the same time, you can also start with something, with a big chronic underlying condition and say, I'll have students come to me and say, I want to write a story about, my sister who's a drug addict. Okay, that's fine, but like, how are you going to crystallize that so that we can watch it unfold in scene? That's a big chronic underlying condition. And if you try to write it as such, you're going to have, 100 pages of notes and a lot of feelings, a lot of ideas, but not, a storyline. The way to get to a storyline is to see how you could crystallize that big, inchoate, complicated issue into a few finite, observable, acute problems. So you say, well, there was the incident when she, did this, and that was the first time we realized that she was using drugs. Great. Crystallize that in scene, write it out in scene. That's scene one. Or maybe before that is a different scene when she was healthy, and that helps us understand the change that she went through. So then, you look at, okay, how did it escalate? Pick one scene where she did something else that made you realize, wow, she's not just using drugs recreationally, but that she actually is starting to sacrifice her work life or her other values in order to get drugs or use drugs. Find one scene or create one scene that illustrates that and play that out in scene. And the reader, you won't have to say, all of the subtext stuff. You won't have to tell us the understory. We will figure it out for ourselves. Trust your reader. We want to do that work, and you got to let us do that work. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is this. I've been talking about all of this as though there were a sort of one-to-one correlation between the plot of the story and the understory, as if every element of the plot serves to illuminate some, chronic underlying condition in the understory. And the truth is that it doesn't have to be that kind of one-to-one correlation. In fact, they don't always have to even be fully related. A character can be dealing with, getting lost in the woods on the surface of the story and trying to survive out in the cold while they are, in the understory going through a horrible divorce, which may have been the reason that they left the house that night and got lost in the woods, but it may, what they do in the woods may not directly illuminate the bigger chronic underlying conditions that they're dealing with. Those chronic underlying conditions are just the water that they're swimming in. They just add depth and complexity and character to a story. So, it doesn't always have to be that they are perfectly related or correlated. And this is especially true when you have characters who are dealing with, sort of when you're trying to illuminate broader social issues or existential issues. Characters, we are all dealing with those problems all of the time while we get our car stuck in traffic or have a car accident or have bad news at the doctor's office. So it's just, I just want to, make sure that you don't think of it as too much of a schematic, like this illuminates that and that illuminates this, and altogether we have a paint by numbers kind of situation. It's not necessarily that way. So all of this affords you a lot of flexibility, I think, and I hope that this will help you maybe develop kind of more depth and resonance to some acute problems that you might have been working with in your stories. And maybe if you are trying to deal more directly with kind of these big chronic underlying conditions, I hope this gives you a few strategies for how you can present them on the page without necessarily having to do the really serious heavy lifting of fully articulating every one of those problems explicitly. If you have questions, please just let me know. I'd be happy to have more conversation about this. But I think that's all I have for now. Thank you.